controversies associated with that and the science associated with it. Like I say, I'm attempting in this series, for those who may not have been here all the time, to take the position of both a scientist and a believer and show you that those two are not in conflict with one another. If you're talking about actual truth, real truth, those two are not in conflict with one another, right? So I'm going to shift today to the next great event in the scriptures, which is the Great Flood. And I think oftentimes when we think about the flood, it's presented as a Bible story, oftentimes, right? And today we seem to equate that phrase with fairy tales. And a lot of people don't believe it ever happened, right? No science to support that sort of thing, right? And I'm going to try to sort of contest that statement here a little bit today. But, and again, my source, same source as last week, but I noticed that this book that I'm referring to here is actually available online. I mean, you don't have to buy it. You can read it online. They put it online for you. And so that's for that first references there. Dr. Brown has created this organization called Creation Science. And as I mentioned earlier, he had set out originally, he was an evolutionist, millions of years kind of guy, and he set out to disprove the Bible scientifically. So he goes and does all this homework and math and science and all that stuff. If you want to read that stuff, I would encourage you to take a look at it online. It's free, if for no other reason, just to see how much homework went into this thing. I wouldn't expect everybody to want to read it, because you have to want to read it, because he goes into exhaustive detail. But in the beginning of that online book, there's a link there for this YouTube video on the hydroplate theory, which we're going to start talking about today. And once again, it's some associate of his, Brian, somebody, that gives this presentation. And he goes into exhaustive detail. It's 6 parts, and it's almost 3 hours long. But it'd give you a good, it's more than an overview. It'll give you a pretty good detailed description of what the hydroplate theory is. And I'm going to try to just kind of hit the high points today. We won't get through it all today, I don't think. It might take 2 or 3 lessons to get through it, because it's not just about the hydroplate theory. It's about all the other things that have affected the earth since the flood. Like I say, we tend to think of the flood oftentimes because it was presented as a story, as well. It was just a big storm, and it rained for 40 days and a lot of rain, and that was it. That's pretty far from the truth. This was the greatest geophysical event, cataclysmic event, since the creation itself. And the earth has still not even recovered from it. The earth is still adjusting from that particular event, right? So I hope to show you some of that stuff over the next 2 or 3 lessons. But like I say, most folks don't believe it. I'm going to try to set it up in the context of what we talked about earlier about a valid scientific explanation or investigation. Because as we discussed, this is going to be historical science, which we talked about earlier is you can't prove. I mean, I can't go back and recreate the flood so I can study it and see how it worked, and take all the measurements and stuff like that. Because, well, even if I could, after we were done, we'd be dead. So what good would it do us, right? So we can't go back. But the question is there scientific evidence? Is there actual evidence of what may have happened that would support the biblical account? And so if we were doing the scientific process correctly here, my opinion, we take the other discussion along with this discussion and line them up side by side and objectively compare the evidence that exists and see which one it supports better, right? And at the end of the day, our observation, remember we start with an observation, we do a hypothesis, and then we try to collect all the evidence and do experiments and tests or whatever we want to prove the hypothesis true or false, or if we have to modify it in some way. Well, that's exactly what Mr. Brown did, right? Because he set out to disprove the Bible scientifically and the whole discussion of the creation and the flood and all that business, and discovered that the more testing and experimentation and actual application of science that we can get our fingers on today, that we don't have to make up, right? It does more to support the biblical account than the other. So he changed his ways. I mean, he turned around, he repented, if you will, right? And he became a believer, created this outfit called Creation Science and has been continuing that research ever since. So we're going to try to line these two things up. But if you keep in the back of your mind, the two big discussions or hypotheses, if you will, that we have on the table are we observe this thing, that this stuff exists, okay? There's a discussion about a flood. And there are a lot of folks who will acknowledge that there is evidence of a flood, the most prominent being the fact that we're standing on what's called sedimentary rock, right, which is layers of stuff that's put down by water. But what the other side is trying to do, in most cases, they'll accept whatever evidence exists, right, but they try to explain it without God, because their going in assumption is there is no God, supernatural doesn't exist, therefore it's not scientific, we're not even going to consider it, right? And our view is, here's all this evidence, and it's explained by God, right? So we're going to try to line those two up and compare the two. So there's some tough questions associated with this, and a lot of folks, just like the whole layers of rock and millions of years theory, right? There's all these efforts by theologians to go, well, gee, if that's actual science, then I have to normalize that somehow with the scriptures, right? And so the way that's usually done in the case of the flood is they'll call it a local flood. They said, well, it really wasn't global. It really wasn't over the whole earth. It was a big storm, and a lot of water and a lot of flood and so on and so forth, but not global, local. That's one of the prevailing theories today. So these are some tough questions that come up. One is, could it really have been global? And oh, by the way, how did that water cover Mount Everest, right? Tallest point in the earth, right? Because it says it covered all the mountains. And 40 days of constant rain, well, that's impossible. We've never observed that sort of thing before. Where did all the water come from? Where did it go to? Which we're going to try to explain. Again, I can't get through it all today. Over the next couple of weeks, we'll try to explain all that stuff. But couldn't it have been local? For them, it's just too fantastic to believe. But I would say, if you look at the scriptures, there are many places in the Bible that refer to the flood as a historical event. I mean, those throughout the Bible, they talk about the flood, your fathers before the flood, what happened after the flood. Lots of references to the flood. And it is assumed by those people, the ancients, that it was, in fact, a historical event. In fact, even Peter says, whereby the world that then was being overflowed with water perished. So that word world is translated from the Greek word cosmos, which we understand, is in fact the whole world. And overflowed is translated from this cataclysmo, which the term from which we get our word cataclysm, right? And it overflowed the entire earth and everything perished. So even Peter in the New Testament is looking back 2,000 years from where he was and referring to it as an established historical fact. So we know that historical science can't be proven because I can't go back and recreate the flood, but the best we could do is to have an eyewitness account that wrote it down. Or you have a written historical account from a trusted source. Right? That's the best we can actually do in terms of proof. But there is hard evidence, I think, all around us, if we want to look for it, that shows that such a thing had to have happened. We can't prove that scientifically, like in the world of testing and experimentation, but that's as close as we can get with historical science. So let's look at what the scriptures actually say. I want to go through, it's described in chapters 6 through 9 of Genesis. I won't go through the whole thing, but I'll try to hit the high points and show you some things that I think are sort of overlooked, shall we say, today, particularly in the light of this notion that it might have been a local flood as opposed to a global flood. It says, and God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast and the creeping thing and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. And behold, I, even I, do bring a flood of waters upon the earth to destroy all flesh, wherein is the breath of life from under the heaven, and everything that is in the earth shall die. Now, does that sound like a local flood to you? It doesn't sound very local, frankly, because he says the wickedness of man was great in the earth. all over the earth. Would it suggest for a local flood that there were some regions somewhere that weren't in the local flood that were righteous? Was that the case? No, because God said he's destroying everything. Why couldn't he just move Noah to this righteous area? Instead of destroying everything. If there's a place over there that's not wicked, why doesn't he just move Noah over there? I mean, that's what he did with Abraham, right? He moved him out of Ur to Canaan. So, because he intended to destroy everything. It says that a grieved man in his heart had made him. Does that mean that only some of them grieved God in his heart? Or was it all of them? He said it was all of them. So, and just from a logical perspective, how does the local flood wipe out all birds? He said he killed everything, and he did. So in Genesis chapter 7, it says, in the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, in the 17th day of the month, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Two things I'd like to point out here. The first is the date. This is the 600th year of Noah's life, in the second month, on the 17th day of the month. This is probably one of the most accurately recorded dates in the Bible, right? Because if you go back and look at Genesis and the account of who begat who and all that business, it talks about Adam begat, and he begat, and he begat, and begat, and he begat sons and daughters, and he lived so many years and he died. And if you plot all that stuff out, right, it is recordable right down to the day of the flood, or the year of the flood, 1656 years after Adam, right? So this date can be pinpointed in history down to the year when Adam was on the earth. Pretty precise, and therefore you would think that why would God pay that much attention to the actual date? Probably because it's a pretty significant event, right? And the other one is kind of interesting, I think. It says, the same day were all the fountains of the great deep broken up, and the windows of heaven were opened. Now, that sounds like kind of an odd way to say, and it started raining, right? Because he had told Noah for 120 years it's going to rain. He didn't tell him how that was going to happen. He just said it's going to rain. And he was ridiculed for it for 120 years, for saying it's going to rain. Brother Branham talks about it often, that the scientists back then probably says, we're going to look up there. There's no water up there. What do you mean it's going to rain? So what does this mean? We're going to talk about that in some detail today and in some coming lessons, but kind of an odd way. This is when the flood started, right? Kind of an odd way to say, and it started raining. Tuck that one away for a second. He says, and the rain was upon the earth 40 days and 40 nights, which we all know. That's all we've been taught, right? But this wasn't just your average rain shower. It wasn't even a thunderstorm. This was a deluge. I mean, this is a downpour of epic proportions. And it's going on for 40 days and 40 nights. But here's one that kind of gets overlooked a lot of times. It says, and the flood was 40 years upon the earth, meaning it's 40 days. It was raining for 40 days upon the earth, and the waters increased and bare up the ark, lift up above the earth. And the waters prevailed and were increased greatly upon the earth, and the ark went upon the face of the waters. And the waters prevailed exceedingly upon the earth, and the high hills that were under the whole heaven and were covered. Now, Dr. Brown here points out that what this is saying is this word prevail is normally translated as overcome. It means to overcome something, right? So it's overcoming the earth, it's covering the earth, and so on and so forth. But that prevailing business and increasing business goes on even after the rain stopped, right? So it rains for 40 days, and the waters continue to prevail after that, and they prevail exceedingly after that. It says 15 cubits upward did the waters prevail, and the mountains were covered, right? And all flesh died that moved upon the earth, both fowl and of cattle and of the beast and of every creeping thing that creeped upon the earth and every man. So we'll talk a little bit more about how he derives this sort of thing, and I think he's probably got it right here. But people go, oh, well, 15 cubits, that's 22 and a half feet. And you're telling me it covered all the mountains? How did it cover Mount Everest? And I would submit to you or ask you, who said Mount Everest even existed before the flood? We'll talk about that one somewhat as well. So it's 15 cubits above what? Not Mount Everest. So, and the waters prevailed upon the earth 150 days. This is where he's getting his business to continue. The waters continue to rise even after it stops raining for 150 days. Where did that water come from? We'll get there. Chapter 8 says, and God remembered Noah and every living thing and all the cattle that was with him in the ark. And God made a wind to pass over the earth, and the waters assuaged. And the fountains also of the deep and the windows of heaven were stopped, and the rain from heaven was restrained. So this word, assuage, means to settle down or calm down or subside or hold back. In other words, it stopped what it was doing. So it was prevailing until that time. The waters were still flowing until that time and increasing. And after 150 days, it stopped. It says, the waters returned from off the earth continually, and after the end of the 150 days, the waters were abated. They stopped rising. And the ark rested in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, upon the mountains of Ararat. Now, if you remember, it started in the 1st month, right? So we're 7 months downrange. It says, and the waters decreased continually upon the until the 10th month, and in the 10th month, on the 1st day of the month, were the tops of the mountains seen. Where's all this water going? Any thoughts? Well, we'll get there. Say again. No, because where's it coming from? It's not raining. Exactly, it was subterranean, right? So we'll get there in a second. And it came to pass in the 601st year, remember he started in his 600th year, but in the 601st year, in the 1st month, the 1st day of the month, the waters were dried up from off the earth, and Noah removed the covering of the ark, and looked, and behold, the face of the ground was dry. Now it's been a year, okay, since he went into the ark. And then it says, in the 2nd month, on the 7th and 20th day of the month, was the earth dried. And God spake unto Noah, saying, go forth of the ark, thou and thy wife, thy son's wife with thee. Bring forth with thee every living thing that is with thee of all flesh, both fowl and cattle, and every creeping thing that creepeth upon the earth, that they may breed in the earth, be fruitful, and multiply upon the earth. And Noah went forth, and his sons and his wife and his sons' wives with him. Every beast, every creeping thing, and every fowl, and whatsoever creepeth upon the earth after their kinds, went forth out of the ark. Notice, this is the end of the 2nd month, the 27th day of the 2nd month. When he rested, when he noticed that the ground was dry, was the 1st day of the 1st month. So it's 60 days later almost, from the time he observed that the ground was dry, before he was allowed to leave the ark. Why would that be? Well, we have some thoughts on that as well. So if you were to put this on a timeline, it looks something like this. Right, so on the 1st day, the fountains of the great deep were broken up, it says, right? It rained for 40 days and 40 nights. There was 150 days where the waters continued to arise. They were prevailing. And after that, the waters receded. The mountains became visible after about 224 days. And then the waters drained, and the earth was observed to be dry at 314 days. He was allowed to leave the ark 371 days after he entered, right? So typically, the way this is, water people understand it, is that, Noah went into the ark, we had this rain shower for 40 days, it flooded everything, and he came to rest on the mountains of Ararat, and he left the ark. Not so. He left the ark 371 days after he went in, right? And for the last 60 days of that, the earth was actually dry. So why? So I'm now going to introduce, first of all, let's go back to the local flood thing. If it were a local flood, have we ever observed a flood at all that produced 40 days of continuous downpour? The Hebrew calls it geshem. It's this torrential downpour. We haven't observed that before. It covered all the distant mountains. It caused a rising of water for 150 days after it stopped raining. The flooding was present for 314 days, and it left the land unsafe and unstable for 57 days after the ground was dry. And we're going to get to that in a second, is this conclusion he draws. Why would he be forbidden to leave the ark after the ground was already dry? Right? So, introducing the hydroplate theory. And this comes from Dr. Brown, and I would stress that it is a theory. And so, just like with all the historical science, it can't be proven by experiment or testing or that kind of thing. But we're going to look for evidence that might support this kind of theory. And here's the difference between this theory and the theory of evolution or millions of years kind of a thing, right? Because we're starting from the point of view that God's account, the biblical account, is true. They're starting from the point of view that God doesn't exist, there's no such thing as supernatural, therefore it cannot be true. And so they're trying to explain everything that we see without God. And when you take God away from it, frankly, it leaves a void in your understanding of how things might have happened. If you're going to say supernatural doesn't even exist, therefore, we can't observe it, we can't prove it, we can't measure it, therefore it doesn't exist, right? When you take that kind of thing out of it, it leaves a void. And so you got to kind of make something up to fill the void, right? And that's where it kind of falls apart. But I'm going to try to show you here where this is at least one scientific theory that is supported by real science that supports the biblical account. I'm not saying it's absolute truth necessarily, but this is the way the scientific process should work, right? We put both arguments up side by side, gather all the evidence, and see which one is supported better, right? So this is his theory, which frankly I think makes some sense. That's the reason I'm sharing it with you. But the major assumption here is that there was subterranean water. When the fountains of the great deep broke up, that meant there was water subterranean that started gushing forward. That's where the water came from. It blew up in the air, we'll get to in a second, but that's what came down as rain. This is about half the water now in the oceans was once interconnected chambers 60 miles below the entire Earth's surface. At thousands of locations, the chamber's sagging ceiling pressed down against the chamber's floor. I'm going to show you that here in a second. These solid contexts will be called pillars. Now, you've heard the Bible talk about the pillars of the earth. Anybody ever wonder where the foundations of the earth were? The Bible talks many times about the foundations of the earth. What is that? The earth is a ball floating out in space, right? We'll get to that. He says the average thickness of the subterranean water was at least 1 mile. That's average. It goes kind of up and down. So in some places it might have been as much as 2, maybe 3 miles thick. Above the subterranean water was a granite crust, and beneath that water is the Earth's mantle. I'll show you a picture in a minute. There's a minor assumption, he says, which is a global continent. He says the Earth's pre-flood crust encircled the globe. On the crust were deep and shallow seas, mountains, and generally smaller than those of today. So you've probably all heard, let me ask this question first. I know some go to Christian school here, some go to public school, some are homeschooled, which I'll assume is Christian schooled, right? We even talk about the flood in school. We're even taught about the flood in science. Did they talk about it being a global flood or a local flood? Global flood, okay, that's Christian school, okay? Because in a lot of Christian circles, they try to normalize it with science and say, it's probably local, right? Public school, they even talk about the flood at all? Yeah, didn't think so. So you've probably heard, though, that in the science of geology, if you will, that there's a prevailing theory that the continents we see today were once all kind of one glob, right? One continent called Pangea. Have you ever heard of that? And so they broke up over time, and they're drifting apart, and that's the continental drift we see today, and blah, blah, blah. It took millions and billions of years to do that, right? So that's one notion. He's saying, yes, however, that one continent covered the entire Earth at one time. And yes, there were some seas and lakes and sources of water and that kind of thing, but not what we have today. So the minor assumption number 3 is that this granite crust, it's about 60 miles thick, cracked one day, all right? So a small initial crack occurred in the Earth's crust. There were several ways this crack could have started. Once a tension crack formed, the high pressures in the chamber and stress concentrations at each end of the crack would have quickly propagated the crack around the Earth. So he's done all the math on this, if anybody cares. But granite is very, very, very strong in compression if you're pushing it, right? But it's very weak in tension if you're trying to pull it apart. And it's also very brittle. So he did all the calculations of what it takes to crack granite and how quickly a crack in granite that thick would propagate, okay? So we'll get to it in a second. But basically the theory is there's this layer of water underneath this granite crust, right? It's under extreme pressure because of the weight of the granite. And one day it cracked. And this crack went all the way around the Earth and this water comes spewing out, okay? So this is what we're generally taught in school. This is what the inside of the Earth looks like, right? You got the mantle, they call it, which is 1,800 miles thick. You got this outer core, which is molten, like melted rock and lava and magma and that kind of thing. And you got a solid inner core. But today, you got this little crust you see around the outside edge there where the green and the blue and the white is, actually. That's the part we stand on. And it's relatively thin compared to that. I think Brother Brandon calls it like an eggshell or a peeling onion or something like that. But today's scientific measurements have shown that crust that we're standing on is pretty complex. It's not just as simple as being like one piece of material, right? And they do that by putting all these seismic sensors all over the place. The Earth is all instrumented nowadays with these sensors, particularly around areas of high earthquake activity and volcanoes. So we're kind of measuring when something starts rumbling down below, we kind of try to figure out something's going on. That happens, and there's an earthquake or something like that, these low frequency energy waves are propagated out away from that disturbance, right? And they can measure it with these sensors. And if you measure with many sensors, you can triangulate where that wave is going and what's happening, and they kind of map out what's going on underneath our feet, much like sonar does, right? And they found that layer is fairly complex. It's more complicated than what this picture might show. So this is what Walt Brown theorizes for the hydroplate theory. So the brown part there is this granite crust, approximately 60 miles thick. The lighter brown at the bottom of it is kind of and the reason is that if I've got a stack of granite here sitting on the floor that's 60 miles high, the weight of that granite pressing down on the bottom part of it creates so much heat that it actually begins to melt, and it starts becoming kind of pliable. He says at that level, it has a consistency more like a thick putty than it does of rock. But what that does is it kind of mashes it together in a real tight seal like that, so it's sealed against the water. But in certain areas where there's more weight above it, like you might have a mountain above it, you might have a sea above it, or something like that, it's heavier, and so it sags, right? So you see the bottom part there where the pillars are, it sags until it actually contacts the bottom of this subterranean chamber. Those are known as pillars, right? And what I would submit, what he's submitting, is what God is referring to when he says he made the foundations of the earth. When he created the earth, he created it with this layer of water in the middle, okay? So it says several aspects of the earth are shown here. The thickness of the subterranean chamber varied because the chamber's granite roof sagged and pressed against the chamber floor at locations that will be called pillars. Supercritical water in the subterranean chamber dissolved certain minerals in the chamber's floor and ceiling, giving that rock a porous or sponge-like texture. So supercritical water is a pretty special element, right? Because of the weight of the granite on top of it, water is normally referred to as an incompressible fluid. You can't compress it, right? It can be used for hydraulics if we wanted to use it today. In some cases it is, but in most cases we use oil because it doesn't corrode the metal parts that we use for hydraulics, right? But it's considered to be incompressible. But he's done the calculations to show under 60 miles of granite, that weight is so great, the pressure is actually, the water is actually compressed by about 25%, which is storing large quantities of energy, right? And when you do that in a confined space, the temperature increases as well, right? So supercritical water is, at this level, is at about 372,000 psi and more than 705 degrees centigrade or Fahrenheit. Above that temperature, you can just keep adding heat and adding heat and adding heat, and it can't change state anymore. It is now basically these tiny little droplets, that are floating around that are just doing nothing but absorbing energy, creating more energy, and being more dangerous, frankly. And science has actually created supercritical water in the lab, but until recently, we had never seen it naturally. So we'll get to that in a second. It says quartz is one of the first minerals to dissolve. In the presence of this supercritical water, the bottom of the chamber above and the bottom below begin to sort of dissolve a little bit. It says this opened tiny grain-sized pockets totaling 27% of the volume of granite. Trapped supercritical water that filled these tiny particles remains today. In fact, in 2008, supercritical water was discovered 2 miles under the Atlantic floor. Scientists were shocked at finding the first naturally occurring supercritical water. This vast, steady source of superhot water, thick with dissolved minerals, including the rare isotope helium-3 and sometimes hydrocarbons, is jetting up through ocean floors as black smokers. We'll see that here in a second. But supercritical water, just bear in mind, is under this huge, immense pressure, 372,000 psi, and it's very hot. So this is some of the scriptures that kind of support some of this stuff. In Samuel, it says, he raiseth up the poor out of the dust, lifteth up the beggar from the dunghill, to set him among princes, and to make them inherit the throne of glory. For the pillars of the earth are the Lord's, and he hath set the world upon them. Okay? I don't know about you, but I read something like that in the past, I'm going, what are the pillars of the earth? How did he set the earth upon them? Well, so this theory provides a possible explanation for that. And many times it talks about the foundations of the earth. This is God talking to Job. It says, where wast thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Declare if thou hast understanding. Right? This is a black smoker. It says black smokers, some as hot as 867 degrees Fahrenheit, were discovered in 1977, jetting up on a portion of the mid-oceanic ridge in the Pacific. We're going to be talking about these ridges here in a second, but that's his explanation for where this water came from. He says, many other black smokers have since been found along the entire globe encircling mid-Atlantic ridge. This is the crack we talk about. Even inside the Arctic Circle and near Antarctica. Supercritical water has been produced by man in strong containers, but never before has supercritical water been seen in its natural state, even around volcanoes. Black smokers we see today show that small amounts of the subterranean water are still escaping from what was the floor of the subterranean chamber. Like I say, this is the greatest geophysical event since the creation. And the earth literally has not fully recovered from it. It is still adjusting. Many of the things we see in the natural world today are adjusting because of what happened here with the flood. So in simplest form, this is the way it looked pre-flood. The brown part is this granite crust, approximately 60 miles thick. The blue there with the SCW, the supercritical water, is the layer underneath that, going somewhere a mile to 2 miles, maybe 3 miles thick. In places it sagged, like there on the right, until it actually touched the foundation of the mantle, which is actually basalt. So 2 things to remember here is that for the most part, this crust that we're standing on, aside from the dirt that is on top of it, is granite. Underneath the granite is mostly basalt. And we'll see here in a second why that's significant. So over time, we have this kind of pressure going on. The blue here on the left, the long blue arrow is showing where there was weight above it, and it sagged until it touched the bottom, okay? But on the right, you see the crack there. Something happened to cause that 60-mile thick crust of granite to crack. And when that happened, the crack propagated all the way around the earth. This layer was the water layer was all the way around the earth, and this water starts spewing out at this unimaginable rate, okay, with unimaginable power. And here's the evidence that he's putting forth for that. You see the dark blue in the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean? Those are, the Atlantic one is called the Mid-Atlantic Ridge, and the Pacific Ocean and others are called the Mid-Oceanic Ridge, right? And this is the scar, he said, that's left from the crack. So we'll talk about that here a little bit more in a second. But it's significant that if you go to the ocean floor and you dig away from some of the sediment, what you find underneath is basalt. On the surface up here, you dig away some of the dirt, what you find underneath is granite. Why would that be different? Well, at the end of the day, it's because of this spewing thing, which we'll talk about next week. I didn't think I could get it all in this week. The edge there where the crack was, where the crack happened, this water comes spewing out with such force that it erodes those edges away, all the way around, to the point where it gets pretty wide because it's coming at such high pressures, right, that the basalt underneath begins to buckle from the pressure underneath, and it pushes up, right? And it causes the continents that we know today to kind of slide away because it's still on this cushion of water. We'll get into that more next week, right? But the point here is that this crack goes kind of all the way around the Earth. Now, I brought a globe here for some show and tell because it's a little harder to see on this particular map because it's flat, and the Earth is a sphere. This is known as a Mercator projection. But basically, the crack goes all the way around the Earth, and in some cases, kind of more than once, it branches off from certain places where it cracked, right? So we might wonder, well, what would cause 60 miles of granite to crack? Well, I would submit even Brother Branham talked about that. He says, now, how could science say rain come from there, from up in the sky? He says, but you see, God knowed how to bring rain from there. He either caused an earthquake or somebody had an atomic power that throwed it and bursted some part of the earth. And it swung backward, thrown it out of its orbit, and now it leans back. And when they did that, the heat of the earth and the cold of the earth and the sun and away from the sun caused the cloud to come over. He's Jehovah Jireh. He can provide himself anything that the word said, right? So Brother Branham actually postulated that there was either a huge earthquake or an atomic bomb that caused this mantle to crack, right? Once it did, say that the crack propagated around the earth in about 2 hours. It goes that quickly. So I wanted to bring the globe because it's a little easier to see. Although I was disappointed when I bought this thing. I thought it said it had topographical features on it, and that normally means that they're raised or lowered. So, and I got it, and it wasn't. But I think it still illustrates the point. This light-colored blue here, I'm going to pass this around. I'm going to leave this for a couple of weeks as well. Here, folks want to look at it. Represents what is in the dark blue here. Whoops. The Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Unfortunately, it's the same color as the continental shelf, so don't get confused with that. But here it is in the Pacific, coming around this way, and as it comes up here, if you'll notice, towards the United States, it actually joins with the Rocky Mountain Range. And so, if you look at all the major mountain ranges on the Earth, you note that they generally run north and south, right? You got the Rockies, you got the Andes, you got the Himalayas, right? And over here from the Indian Ocean, it comes up here and across under Saudi Arabia through Macedonia to the Himalayas. Up there, got the mountains of Norway and Sweden and all those kind of places too, right? So there's a little bit of a spoiler about where the water came from or where it went. Where did it come from? It came from the subterranean chambers, right? Where did it go? It's still here. It makes the oceans we have today, right? Because at the end of the day, when that subterranean chamber was drained, this part sunk, and the continents we know today rose. And we'll see in the scriptures later why that happened, right? And that explains why we have granite on the continents we know today and basalt under the oceans, right? So I'm going to pass that around if you like. It might be a little awkward passing it around, but I just think, shipboard navigator, you know, we use the Mercator projection all the time, and I always thought it didn't look right. The globe actually presents it better. So I was going to actually quit there because going to the next point I can't get done in this particular class. So we'll go into the next part later. But there were three major phases of the flood. There's the rupture phase when that crack happened and the water starts spewing out the way it did, right? And it's not just spewing out. It is spewing out at such great force. Rock and earth and dirt and debris and whatever are being thrown out of this crack at such a violent force. He said we had rocks the size of the state of Maryland being thrown all the way into outer space. Okay? It explains a number of things, including the rain, which Brother Branham talks about here. When you got this hot water that's spewing out into outer space, essentially, right? Some of the stuff is thrown like a big mass like that, like the state of Maryland. It's thrown with such force it actually escapes the Earth's gravity. Little spoiler, he said that's where many of our comets and meteorites come from. Science wants to marvel today. They're looking at these meteorites and these telescopes, and they're doing all these multispectral imaging analysis on it. They go, look at that, there's water on that meteorite. It must have come from another planet. There must be life on another planet. And he's going, nada. That came from here. That's the same water that's in our oceans. Okay? Some of this stuff actually escaped the Earth's orbit, right? And now due to the gravitational forces, all the other planets and stuff like that, they have created an elliptical orbit of their own. But some of this stuff fell back to the Earth. So what's actually being spewed out of this crack is this super dirty water, right? It goes up in the atmosphere and cools, like Brother Branham was talking about, right? And falls back to the earth as rain. Some of it went so far, so fast, it froze, and it falls back to the earth as ice, right? Creating what scientists today would like to call the Ice Age. That's where all that ice came from. And I'm going to show you some evidence here in future lessons that makes a very, very strong case for that argument. The things that we find frozen and the composition of the ice that it's frozen in, right? So this is a cataclysmic event beyond anything we can imagine, right? If you could imagine a rock the size of the state of Maryland being thrown completely out into the outer space, right? It's pretty phantasmal. So I'm going to leave it with that today just because I can't get through the next portion of it today. But you can look at the globe. If you have any questions, want to talk about it some more, I'm certainly available. We just set that over here when we're done, and we'll refer to it over the next few lessons as well. So let's close with a word of prayer. Lord, once again, we know that your word is true. We have the faith that your word is true. But for those who do not believe, Lord, they need more than just saying the Bible said it. And Lord, we hope that you would lead us and guide us in our search for the truth here and show that evidence that actually supports the biblical account. Because we know, Lord, that you are all powerful and you're the one that created all things. And you're the one who created the flood. So, Lord, we pray that you would open our eyes and our hearts and show us those things that we would have need of, that we might have that faith and confidence in your word that it is actually the truth. We ask once again that the word of life will be blessed as it comes from the pulpit this morning, that we come away better equipped to serve you. For we ask it in the name of the Lord Jesus Christ. Amen.